You're standing in a London street in December 1780, and the cold isn't poetic. It's not the kind of winter you see in Christmas cards, soft flakes drifting past glowing windows, children laughing, chestnuts roasting somewhere in the distance. No, this is the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache before you even open your mouth. The kind that turns spit to ice mid-air. The kind that killed 3 people on this street alone last week, and nobody bothered to learn their names. The Thames has been frozen solid for 3 weeks. Not picturesquely frozen, not like a skating rink in a fairy tale. Frozen like a tombstone. Gray ice, thick as a man's arm, covered in a layer of snow that's already brown with soot and horse piss by the time it hits the ground. The city smells like smoke and rot and desperation. Coal fires choke the air until breathing feels like swallowing glass. And everywhere there are bells. Church bells. Handbells. The cheerful, aggressive jingling of street vendors selling holly and ivy and gingerbread shaped like saints. It's Christmas Eve, after all. The season of goodwill. The season of joy. The season when London pretends that freezing to death is festive if you do it while singing carols. But not for him. His name is Ezra Scrooge, no relation to the fictional miser you're thinking of, though the irony will become clear soon enough. He's 43 years old, a clerk in a shipping office near the docks, and he hates Christmas with a purity of feeling most people reserve for war or betrayal. Not because he's cruel. Not because he's selfish, not because he's a monster, but because Christmas, to Ezra, is a lie wrapped in tinsel and sold to people too desperate to question it. He's tried to like it. God knows he's tried. As a boy, he loved the carols, the candles, the way his mother would save pennies all year just to afford a goose on Christmas Day. She'd sing while she cooked, her voice thin but sweet, and for one day, just one, the world felt safe, warm, possible. But then his mother died on Christmas Eve, choked on a fishbone at a neighbor's charity dinner. One of those awful performative meals where the wealthy invite the poor to their tables so they can feel virtuous for a few hours before going back to, ignoring them for the other 364 days of the year. His mother had been so grateful, so happy. She'd cried when they served the first course, overwhelmed by the generosity, by the abundance, by the fantasy that maybe, just maybe, someone cared. And then she'd taken a bite of fish. Ezra was 8 years old. He watched her face turn red, then purple. Watched her claw at her throat. Watched the wealthy guests panic and shout and try to help in that useless, fluttering way that people help when they've never actually faced a crisis. Someone slapped her back. Someone else tipped her forward. Someone ran for a doctor who never came. She died on the floor of a stranger's dining room, surrounded by half-eaten food and horrified faces, while a choir sang, "God rest ye merry gentlemen," in the next room. The wealthy guests left quickly after that. Sent their condolences. Paid for the funeral, told Ezra's father what a tragedy it was, what a shame, how dreadfully sorry they were. Then they went home to their warm houses and their living families and never thought about Sarah Scrooge again. Ezra's father thought about nothing else. He'd loved his wife in the quiet, steady way of men who aren't good with words. Her death broke something in him that couldn't be repaired. He started drinking. Not dramatically, no rage, no violence, no theatrical displays of grief. He just faded, went to work, came home, drank until he couldn't think, repeated. By 12th night, he was dead too. Found frozen in an alley, empty bottle still clutched in his hand, on a morning so cold, the constable's breath hung in the air like a ghost. Ezra learned 3 things that winter. 1. Christmas is a performance, and the performers always go home. 2. Kindness is conditional, and the conditions are never in your favor. 3. Hope is a trap that makes the inevitable disappointment hurt worse. So he stopped hoping. Stop celebrating. Stop participating in the collective delusion that December was anything other than the month when poor people die faster than usual. For 20 years now, he's worked through Christmas. Volunteered for the shifts no one else wants. Sat alone in the office while the rest of London gets drunk and sings songs about peace on earth and goodwill toward men, both of which are provably, demonstrably false. It's better this way, he tells himself. Cleaner, more honest, less painful. But this year, something shifts. It starts small, the way disasters always do. 3 days before Christmas, a letter arrives at his desk, sealed with red wax, addressed in a handwriting he doesn't recognize. Inside, a single sentence. You are invited to remember. No signature, no address, no explanation. Just those 5 words and a date. December 24th, midnight. Ezra crumples it up and throws it in the fire. Some prank, probably. Some bored clerk with too much time and too little sense. He goes back to his ledgers and forgets about it. The next day, there's another letter. Same wax, same handwriting. This one says, "The snow will teach you." He burns that one too, but his hands shake slightly as he does it. On the 3rd day, Christmas Eve morning, the final letter arrives. Come to the bridge, or stay a ghost forever. Now, Ezra isn't a superstitious man. He doesn't believe in ghosts or miracles or any of the sentimental garbage people peddle this time of year. He believes in ledgers and numbers and the cold, indifferent mathematics of survival. But that last line, stay a ghost forever, gets under his skin. Because that's exactly what he is, isn't it? A ghost. A man moving through the world without touching it, without being touched, without leaving any mark that suggests he was ever here at all. So, on Christmas Eve, against every rational instinct he possesses, Ezra Scrooge puts on his coat, wraps a scarf around his face, and walks out into the worst snowstorm London has seen in a century. The wind hits him like a fist. The streets are empty, the bells finally silent. The world is nothing but white and black and the sound of his own breathing, too loud inside his head. He walks toward London Bridge, and standing in the center, barely visible through the swirling snow, is a figure, tall, hooded, waiting. Ezra's heart does something stupid it hopes. He takes a step forward. The figure raises one hand, and the snow, impossibly, stops falling. If this feels too real, subscribe before it gets worse. Let's pause here. Freeze the frame. Zoom out from Ezra standing in that impossible circle of stillness, and talk about what a Grinch actually is. Not the Dr. Seuss version, we'll get there eventually. But the original concept, the archetype, the person who hates Christmas, the man who flinches when carols start playing, the woman who feels nothing but exhaustion when December rolls around and the world demands joy like it's a tax you can't avoid paying. We call them Grinches now, but in 1780, they didn't have a name. They were just disappointed, tired, grieving in a season that doesn't allow grief, angry in a season that criminalizes anger, human in a season that demands you perform something more. And there were more of them than you'd think. Because here's the thing about Christmas in the 18th century. It wasn't cute. It wasn't Hallmark movies and gingerbread lattes and matching family pajamas. It was a holiday designed by the rich, for the rich, paid for by everyone else. The poor worked through Christmas. They served the feasts they couldn't afford to eat. They hauled coal for fires they'd never warm themselves by. They froze in the streets while the wealthy toasted to goodwill and charity and all the other virtues that somehow never translated into actual warmth or bread or safety. The hypocrisy was staggering. Charles Dickens would write about this 60 years later, in 1843, when he published A Christmas Carol. But Dickens didn't invent Ebenezer Scrooge. He just gave a name and a narrative to something that already existed, a bitterness so deep it became a kind of philosophy, a refusal to participate in the charade so complete it looked like villainy to people who were still willing to pretend. Ezra Scrooge, the real Ezra Scrooge, the one standing on London Bridge in a snowstorm that defies physics, was one of the first. But he wasn't alone. History is full of Christmas haters, people who looked at the holiday and saw only performance, only hypocrisy, only the gap between what we say we believe and what we actually do. Take Oliver Cromwell, who literally banned Christmas in England in 1647, made it illegal. Soldiers patrolled the streets on Christmas Day, tearing down decorations, arresting anyone caught feasting or singing carols. Why? Because Cromwell thought Christmas was too indulgent, too pagan, too Catholic, too fun. For 11 years, England had no Christmas. And plenty of people more than history likes to admit were fine with that. Or the Puritans in America, who did the same thing. In Massachusetts, from 1659 to 1681, celebrating Christmas was a crime. You could be fined 5 shillings for hanging a wreath. 5 shillings, about $50 in today's money. For a wreath. For the crime of decorating. Why? Because Christmas, they argued, was a distraction from the hard, cold truth of existence. That life is suffering, death is certain. And decorating a tree won't change either of those facts. They weren't wrong, exactly. They were just joyless. Determined to strip away anything that made suffering even slightly more bearable. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the Grinch isn't a villain. Maybe he's a realist. A person who's seen too much to pretend anymore. Who's lost too much to celebrate. Who looks at the world's insistence on joy and thinks, how dare you? How dare you ask me to smile when everything hurts? Ezra Scrooge certainly thought so. For 20 years, he'd watched London pretend. Pretend that Christmas mattered. Pretend that good intentions were sufficient. Pretend that singing about peace on earth could somehow erase the fact that children were dying of cold in workhouses. That women were selling their bodies for bread. That the Thames was full of corpses no one bothered to name. And every year the pretending got louder. The bells rang longer. The feasts grew larger. The churches filled with people who wouldn't look at a beggar the other 364 days of the year, but who showed up on Christmas Eve to feel virtuous for an hour. Ezra hated them. Hated their hypocrisy. Hated their comfort. Hated the way they could smile and sing and go home to warm fires while the city froze outside their windows. But more than anything, he hated that part of him still wanted to believe. Still wanted Christmas to be real. Still hoped, despite everything, that maybe this year would be different. That's the real tragedy of the Grinch. Not that he hates Christmas, but that he hates himself for wanting it to be true. And that's what the figure on the bridge knows. That's why I called him here. Because Ezra said he doesn't believe in Christmas, doesn't believe in hope, doesn't believe in anything. But if that were true, he wouldn't have come to the bridge. He would have burned the letters and forgotten about them. He would have stayed home, safe in his numbness, untouchable in his bitterness. But he came. Which means some part of him, some small, desperate, pathetic part, still wants to believe that things could be different. That he could be different. That the world isn't exactly as cold as it seems. You forgot how to sleep, the figure said. And it's true. Ezra hasn't had a full night's sleep in years. Not since his mother died. Not since he realized that the world doesn't care if you're good or kind or hopeful. It just keeps spinning, indifferent, while you cling to whatever shred of meaning you can invent. Sleep, in this context, isn't rest. It's surrender. It's the ability to let go, to trust that tomorrow will come whether you worry about it or not. To close your eyes and believe, even for a moment, that you're safe. Ezra can't do that anymore. And neither can you, probably. Not really. Not in a world where every day brings new reasons to stay awake, stay vigilant, stay afraid. So you scroll, you work, you distract yourself. You fill the silence with noise, the darkness with light, the emptiness with anything but the thought that maybe you're as alone as Ezra. Welcome to the club. Population: everyone who's ever been disappointed by hope. You're not on the bridge anymore. The transition happens without warning, without sensation. One moment you're standing in that impossible circle of stillness, snow suspended in midair like someone hit pause on reality. The next moment you're in a room, small, dark, the walls slick with condensation, the air thick with the smell of mildew and tallow, and something else, something sweet and rotten that you can't quite identify, but that makes your stomach turn. There's a single candle burning on a wooden table. The flame gutters and jumps in a draft you can't locate, casting shadows that move like living things across the damp walls. The light it gives is barely enough to see by, but you don't need much. Because the only thing in this room, besides you and the table and the dying candle, is a boy. He's maybe 7 years old, maybe 8. It's hard to tell poverty has a way of making children look both older and younger than they are. Their faces too gaunt, their eyes too knowing, their bodies stunted by hunger, while their expressions age decades in days. He's sitting on the floor in the corner, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around his shins, and he's humming. No, not humming. Trying to hum. Trying to remember the melody to a carol he used to know, back when there was still a back when. But the notes keep slipping away from him, elusive as smoke, and every time he loses the thread, he stops, pauses, starts over, again, and again, and again. You realize, with a slow, sinking horror, that he's been doing this for hours, maybe days. Maybe he'll keep doing it forever, stuck in this room, in this moment, chasing a melody he can no longer catch. Where are we? Ezra's voice cuts through the silence, sharp and too loud. He's standing beside you now, or maybe you're standing beside him. It's hard to tell. The rules of space don't seem to apply here. The figure in the hood is gone, but its absence feels deliberate. Feels like it's watching from somewhere you can't see. No one answers. The boy doesn't look up. Doesn't stop his broken humming. Doesn't acknowledge that anyone else exists in this terrible little room. Ezra takes a step forward. His boots make no sound on the floor. Who is he? And then, because the universe has a cruel sense of timing, the door opens. A woman enters. Late 20s, maybe 30, though it's hard to tell with her too life has worn her down to something ageless and exhausted. Her dress is threadbare, patched in a dozen places, clean but worn to translucence. Her hair is tied back with a strip of cloth. Her hands are red and raw, knuckles swollen, fingertips cracked and bleeding in places. She's been washing clothes in the Thames, you realize. In December, in water so cold it's half ice. For pennies that won't be enough. She's carrying a basket. Inside, a single potato, a crust of bread, a heel of cheese so small it might as well be imaginary. "Jacob," she says softly, her voice hoarse. "I'm home." The boy Jacob stops humming. The silence that follows is somehow worse than the sound. He looks up at his mother. His face is blank, empty. Like someone reached inside him and scooped out everything soft and replaced it with stone. "Did you get the goose?" he asks. His voice is flat, dead. The voice of someone who already knows the answer but needs to hear it said anyway. The woman's face crumples, just for a second. Just long enough for you to see the weight of every failed promise, every broken hope, every lie she's told herself and her son to keep moving forward. Then she smiles. It's the worst thing you've ever seen, that smile. Bright and brittle and absolutely unconvincing. "Not this year, love," she says, setting the basket down with trembling hands. "But I got us bread, and cheese, and a lovely potato. We'll have a feast, you and me. It'll be just like I promised." Jacob doesn't respond, doesn't smile, just stares at her with those empty, knowing eyes. "You said we'd have a goose," he says quietly. You said we'd have a goose and pudding and a proper Christmas dinner. You said Father would come home. You said it would be like before." "Jacob, you lied." The word lands like a slap. The woman flinches. Ezra flinches. You flinch, even though you're not really here, even though this isn't really happening, except it is. It did. It happens every day in 1,000 variations across a city that pretends to care. Jacob doesn't flinch. He just goes back to humming that same broken melody, and the woman stands there in the doorway with her basket of not enough and her smile cracking at the edges. And the candle flickers, and the room feels smaller and colder and more suffocating than any space has a right to feel. "This is Christmas," the voice says. The figure's voice, though you still can't see it. It comes from everywhere and nowhere, layered and wrong. This is what you hate. This is what you refuse to see. Ezra's jaw is tight. His hands are clenched into fists at his sides. "I see it every day," he says through gritted teeth. "No, you see the symptoms. You see the poverty, the cold, the hunger, the injustice, but you don't see the hope. And the hope is what makes it unbearable." "Hope?" Ezra spits the word like poison. "That's not hope. That's delusion. That's a woman lying to a child who's too smart to believe her and too powerless to do anything about it." "Yes," the voice agrees. "That's exactly what it is. And it's all she has." The woman kneels beside Jacob, brushes the hair back from his forehead with her ruined hands. "I know it's not what I promised," she says quietly, desperately, "but we're together. That's something, isn't it? That's enough." Jacob doesn't answer, doesn't stop humming, doesn't acknowledge her touch. "And next year," the woman continues, her voice rising with manufactured brightness, "next year will be better. Your father will come home. We'll have a proper feast. You'll see, love. Things will get better. They always do. You just have to believe. But they won't get better. You can see it in her eyes. She knows they won't. Father's dead, probably. Or in debtor's prison. Or drunk in a ditch somewhere, frozen solid with his eyes open. Next year will be the same as this year, or worse, because it's always worse when you're poor and winter comes around again." But she's still saying it. Still performing this ritual of hope, because what else is there? What else can you do when the world is crushing you, except lie to the people you love and pray they're too young to understand the truth? Except Jacob understands. Of course he understands. That's why he stopped singing. Let's rewind. Step back from that terrible room and that dying candle and that child who's forgotten how to hope. Because before Ezra Scrooge became the man who hated Christmas, he was a boy who loved it. This is important, critical, even, because no one is born a Grinch. That's not how it works. You don't emerge from the womb with a cold, shriveled heart and a distaste for tinsel and an instinctive recoil from joy. You become one, slowly, painfully, through a series of disappointments so small and so constant that you stop noticing them individually and start feeling them as a single generalized ache that never quite goes away. Ezra was 8 years old when he stopped believing in Christmas. Not Santa Claus. He'd never believed in Santa Claus. That was a luxury for children whose parents could afford fairy tales. But he believed in the idea of Christmas, the promise of it. That one day a year, the world would pause its cruelty and remember how to be kind. That people would stop pretending they didn't see each other and actually look, actually care. His mother believed it too. Sarah Scrooge, 32 years old, a seamstress with fingers perpetually pricked and bandaged, who sang while she worked and saved pennies in a jar marked December all year long. She had a smile that could light a room even when there was no fire in the hearth, and a faith in human goodness that should have been beaten out of her by circumstance, but somehow, miraculously, wasn't. Every year, she'd take Ezra to St. Paul's Cathedral on Christmas Eve. They'd stand in the back too poor for pews, too proud to beg for better placement, and listen to the choir sing, and his mother would squeeze his hand and whisper, "Listen, Ezra, listen close. That's what heaven sounds like. That's what we're all working toward." And Ezra would listen and believe and feel for one precious hour like the world made sense, like suffering had a purpose, like everything would be all right eventually, until the year she choked. The irony is almost too perfect, isn't it? That a woman who believed in the kindness of strangers would die at a stranger's table, at a charity dinner organized by people who wanted to feel virtuous without actually changing anything. The wealthy hosts had been so proud of themselves for inviting the poor to feast with them on Christmas Eve, so pleased with their own generosity, so convinced that one night of shared food could somehow balance out 364 days of systematic neglect. Sarah Scrooge had been so grateful. She'd worn her only dress mended carefully, a ribbon added at the collar to make it look special. She'd practiced her manners with Ezra for days beforehand, teaching him how to hold a fork properly, how to say please and thank you like he meant it, how to make himself small and polite and non-threatening so the wealthy people wouldn't remember they were afraid of the poor. They'd been seated at a long table, surrounded by strangers. Rich strangers who smelled like lavender and spoke in accents Ezra didn't recognize, who used words he'd never heard and laughed at jokes he didn't understand. The food had been extravagant roast beef swimming in gravy, potatoes drowning in butter, pies filled with fruits Ezra had never tasted and couldn't name. His mother had actually cried when the first course was served, tears streaming down her face, her hand over her mouth, overwhelmed by the abundance, by the reality of enough. More than enough. So much food on one table that you could feed a dozen families for a week. All of it just for one night. One performance of generosity that would be forgotten by morning. And then she'd taken a bite of fish. A delicacy. Something expensive. Something she'd never have been able to afford on her own. Ezra didn't see the moment it happened. 1 second, his mother was smiling, wiping tears from her eyes, reaching for another bite, because when would she ever have this chance again? The next second, she was clutching her throat, her face turning red, then purple, her eyes wide with panic and confusion, and the terrible understanding that something was very, very wrong. People shouted. Someone tried to help, slapped her back hard enough to leave a bruise, tipped her forward over the table, scattered dishes and glasses. Someone else ran for a doctor who would arrive too late. The wealthy host fluttered and panicked and made horrified noises, but didn't actually know what to do because they'd never had to deal with an emergency that couldn't be solved by throwing money at it. And Sarah Scrooge died on the floor of that dining room, surrounded by half-eaten food and horrified faces and the sound of a choir in the next room, singing about peace on earth and mercy mild, while her 8-year-old son stood frozen with a fork in his hand, not understanding why no one could fix this. Why all these wealthy, powerful people who seemed to know everything and control everything couldn't save one woman choking on one bone. The guests left quickly after that. The dinner was ruined after all. They sent their condolences through servants, paid for the funeral that was generous of them. Everyone said so. Told Ezra's father what a tragedy it was, what a senseless accident, how terribly, terribly sorry they were. Then they went home to their warm houses and their living families and never thought about Sarah Scrooge again. Why would they? She was no one, A poor seamstress who'd had the bad grace to die at their table. An embarrassment. A story they'd tell at other dinner parties, shaking their heads at the sadness of it all before moving on to more pleasant topics. Ezra's father never moved on. Thomas Scrooge had loved his wife in the quiet, steady way of men who aren't good with words, who express affection through actions rather than declarations. Her death broke something in him that couldn't be repaired. Couldn't even be examined, really, because what was there to say? That life was cruel, that the world didn't care, that kindness was a trap and hope was a lie? He didn't say any of that. He just started drinking. Not dramatically. There was no rage, no violence, no theatrical displays of grief that might have at least suggested he was processing the loss. He just faded. Went to work. Came home. Drank until he couldn't think. Slept. Repeated. By January, he'd lost his job. Too drunk to work. Too grief-stricken to care. By February, they'd lost the room they rented. By March, Thomas was dead too. Found frozen in an alley with an empty bottle still clutched in his hand on a morning so cold the constable's breath hung in the air like a ghost. And 8-year-old Ezra learned the most important lesson of his life. Christmas is a lie, and hope is the cruelest joke the world plays on people who can't afford to laugh. December 1780. The Great Frost, the winter that history books mention in footnotes, but never fully explain because the reality of it, the bone-deep, life-ending brutality of it, doesn't fit neatly into narratives about progress and civilization and humanity's triumph over nature. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. The Thames froze solid, completely. From bank to bank, a sheet of ice thick enough to hold not just people but carriages, market stalls, printing presses, even an elephant that some entrepreneurial showman brought for entertainment because why not turn apocalypse into profit? The ice stayed frozen for weeks, all of December, into January. London, for the first time in living memory, had to confront the possibility that winter might not end, that spring might not come, that this cold, this absolute, annihilating cold might be permanent. The death toll was staggering. Old people went first, of course, then children, then anyone who couldn't afford enough coal to keep a fire burning 24 hours a day. The workhouses were full, the hospitals were full, the prisons were full. And still people kept dying, in doorways, in alleys, in beds they couldn't afford to heat, in rooms like the one where Jacob sat humming broken carols while his mother lied about next year. The death carts came every morning, piled high with frozen bodies stiff as cordwood. The gravediggers worked overtime, struggling to dig through soil that had turned to stone, cursing the cold and the dead, and the city that kept demanding they make room for more corpses while paying them barely enough to keep themselves alive. It was biblical, apocalyptic. The kind of winter that makes you believe in Old Testament God, the angry one, the vengeful one, the one who sends plagues and floods and reminds you constantly that you are small and weak and utterly at the mercy of forces you cannot control or understand or negotiate with. And yet, and this is the part that matters, the part that explains everything about Christmas and hope and why people like Ezra hate it so much. And yet, London tried to celebrate anyway. On Christmas Eve, 1780, while the Thames glittered like a mirror under a merciless moon and snow fell in sheets so thick you couldn't see two feet in front of your face, someone organized a frost fair on the frozen river. Because of course they did. Because what else do you do when the world is ending? You light a candle. You sing a song. You set up a market stall on ice that might crack at any moment and sell roasted chestnuts to people who might not live to see morning. You pretend, for a few hours, that everything is fine. The fair was surreal. Vendors set up stalls directly on the ice, selling mulled wine and gingerbread and trinkets. Musicians played fills and drums, their fingers going numb between songs. Children skated, laughing until they fell and cried from the cold. Couples danced, holding each other close partly for warmth, partly for comfort, partly because if you're going to die, you might as well die having felt something good one last time. There was even a printing press set up, an actual printing press. Hauled onto the ice with God knows how much effort selling commemorative cards that read, "Printed on the Thames, December 24th, 1780, a souvenir of the apocalypse. Proof that you were here, that you survived this, that you refused to let winter have the last word." It was defiant, absurd, beautiful in its absolute refusal to surrender to despair. Ezra hated it. He'd gone down to the river that evening not to join the fair, but to watch from the edges, to observe the spectacle of people lying to themselves. People pretending that ice was safe, that cold was festive, that any of this was anything other than a desperate, pathetic attempt to ignore the reality of their situation. He stood at the edge of the frozen Thames, arms crossed, face expressionless behind his scarf, and watched. Watched the vendors hawking their wares. Watched the children playing. Watched the couples dancing. Watched London perform joy like it was an obligation, a duty, something you did because not doing it would mean admitting that the cold had won. And that's when he saw her. A girl, 12, maybe 13. Thin as a rail, no. Thinner than that. Thin like a shadow, like something that might disappear if you blinked. She was wearing a dress that was more holes than fabric. No coat, no gloves. Her bare hands red and swollen from the cold. She was standing near one of the vendor stalls, staring at a tray of gingerbread with an intensity that made Ezra's chest tighten uncomfortably. He watched as she looked around, checked to see if anyone was watching, reached out slowly, carefully, with the deliberate casualness of someone who's done this before, and took a piece. The vendor saw. Of course he saw. He'd probably been waiting for it. Shouted. Grabbed her by the wrist hard enough that Ezra heard her small, surprised cry of pain from 15 feet away. Thief. The vendor bellowed. Stealing from honest men. I'll have the constable on you, you little rat. The girl didn't run, didn't fight, didn't even struggle. Just stood there, silent, while the vendor berated her, shook her, threatened her with prison and the workhouse and all the other nightmares that people use to punish the poor for the crime of being hungry. A crowd gathered. Some people laughed. Most just turned away, not wanting to be involved, not wanting to see what they'd all seen 100 times before. Another starving child, another petty theft, another small tragedy that wasn't their problem. Ezra should have turned away too, should have retreated back to his office, back to his ledgers, back to the safe numbness of not caring. He'd perfected that numbness over 20 years. He was good at it. He'd made it his armor, his shield, his entire identity. But his feet were moving before his brain could stop them. He walked through the crowd, pulled a coin from his pocket, more than the gingerbread was worth, probably more than the vendor made in a day, and dropped it on the man's tray. She's paid for, Ezra said flatly. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty, like he'd forgotten how to speak to people, how to be part of the world instead of just observing it from a safe distance. The vendor blinked, looked at the coin, looked at Ezra, released the girl's wrist and pocketed the money without a word of thanks, because why would he thank someone for doing what should have been done in the first place? The girl looked up at Ezra. Her face was filthy, streaked with grime and something that might have been tears or might have been melted snow. Her eyes were too big for her face, too old, too knowing. She didn't say anything, didn't thank him, just stared at him like she was trying to figure out if he was real or just another hallucination brought on by hunger and cold. Go, Ezra said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Just flatly, matter-of-factly, the way you tell someone the time or give directions. She ran, disappeared into the crowd, clutching the gingerbread like it was made of gold. And Ezra stood there, alone again, feeling something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Something small and pathetic and absolutely unwanted. A flicker, a spark. The tiniest, most fragile sensation that maybe one small act of kindness mattered. That maybe the world wasn't entirely rotten. That maybe he wasn't entirely empty. He hated it immediately. Hated the vulnerability of it. Hated how easily it had slipped through his defenses. How one starving girl and one piece of gingerbread could undo 2 decades of careful, deliberate numbness. He felt exposed, raw. Like someone had peeled back his skin and seen something he'd worked very hard to keep hidden, even from himself. So he left, walked away from the Frost Fair, away from the laughter and music and the terrible, fragile lie of Christmas cheer, back up the embankment, through streets gone silent under the weight of snow, back toward his office where numbers made sense and human suffering could be, quantified in ledgers and therefore controlled. And that's when the letters started arriving. 3 letters in 3 days, each one stranger than the last, each one pulling him towards something he didn't understand and didn't want, until Christmas Eve, until a snowstorm, until the bridge, until now. The room with Jacob and his mother dissolves like watercolor in rain, the walls bleeding away, the candle extinguishing, the sound of broken humming fading until all that's left is darkness and the sense of falling through something that isn't quite space. When the world resolves again, you're somewhere else entirely. A bedroom, wealthy, obscenely so. 4-poster bed with velvet curtains the color of dried blood. Mahogany furniture polished to a mirror shine. Persian rugs thick enough to lose your fingers in. Oil paintings in gilt frames, portraits of stern-faced ancestors who look like they died angry and stayed that way. A fire roaring in a marble fireplace, the heat oppressive, suffocating, the kind of warmth that should feel comforting, but instead feels like being slowly cooked alive. The room should feel safe, comfortable. It feels like a tomb. In the bed, buried under layers of blankets despite the fire, is a man. 70 years old, maybe older. It's hard to tell because his face has that strange, preserved quality that comes from never having worked a day in your life. His skin is stretched tight over bone, yellow-gray like old parchment, and his eyes are sunken but open, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that suggests he's been staring for hours, days, maybe years. He's dying. You can see it. Smell it, that sweet rot scent of flesh giving up, of a body shutting down one system at a time. But he's not dead yet. And that, somehow, is the worst part. Who is he? Ezra asks. His voice sounds distant, like he's speaking underwater. Lord Ashford, the figure says. It's standing beside them now, or maybe it's been there all along and you're just noticing. Baron of Kent. Owner of 3 estates, 200 servants, more money than he could spend in 5 lifetimes. And the most miserable man in England. He's dying. He's been dying for 2 years. Ezra frowns. That's not possible. No one lingers that long. Not like this. Look closer. And Ezra does. Looks at the table beside the bed, covered in bottles. Dozens of them. Tinctures and medicines and opiates and expensive treatments imported from the continent at ruinous cost. Remedies from London, from Paris, from Vienna. Snake oil and legitimate pharmaceuticals mixed together because when you're dying and rich enough, you try everything. Look at the servants hovering near the door, 3 of them, exhausted, terrified, waiting for orders from a man who refuses to release them, even in death. They've been here for days, maybe weeks, barely sleeping, because Lord Ashford won't die and won't let them leave, and still has the power to ruin their lives if they disobey. Look at the man himself, Lord Ashford, whose eyes are sharp and clear despite his body's decay, who is conscious, aware, trapped in a corpse that won't quite let him go because he won't quite let it. He's afraid, Ezra says quietly. Terrified, the figure corrects. He spent his entire life accumulating money, property, power, things he could control, things that proved he mattered. And now he's facing the one thing money can't buy and power can't command more time. So he clings, takes the medicines, fights, refuses to surrender even though every moment is agony. That's not cowardice, Ezra says, but his voice lacks conviction. That's survival. That single quotes human. Is it? Or is it just another form of greed? The door opens. A young woman enters, 25, blonde, pretty in a brittle, performative way that suggests she's been beautiful all her life and is terrified of what happens when that stops being true. She's wearing black, already in mourning, though the man she's mourning is still breathing, still watching, still refusing to release his grip on a world that no longer wants him. His daughter, you realize, or granddaughter, some relation close enough to inherit, distant enough not to care. She approaches the bed with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Too bright, too practiced. The smile of someone who's been performing grief and patience for months and is running out of both. "Father," she says, her voice artificially cheerful. "How are you feeling today?" Lord Ashford's eyes swivel toward her. He doesn't speak, hasn't spoken in weeks, according to the doctors. The medicines have stolen his voice, but not his consciousness. He's trapped behind his own eyes, aware of everything, able to express nothing except through slight movements of his hand. His hand moves now, trembling, shaking with effort toward a bell on the table. The woman's smile tightens imperceptibly. "Do you need something? Water? Or medicine?" The hand keeps reaching, desperate, demanding. She picks up the bell, rings it once. A servant appears instantly, as if they've been waiting just outside the door for exactly this moment. Because they have been. They always are. "Yes, milady? My father would like his medicine." The servant hesitates. "Milady, the doctor said." "I don't care what the doctor said. Give him the medicine." "But milady, he's already had 3 doses today. Any more might." "Give him the medicine." The servant obeys. No argument. No protest. Just immediate compliance born from months of this same conversation. This same power dynamic playing out day after day while Lord Ashford refuses to die and his daughter refuses to help him. The servant pours a dark liquid into a spoon, holds it to Lord Ashford's lips. The old man swallows, grimaces. The medicine tastes like poison, probably is poison in sufficient quantities, but it keeps him conscious, keeps him aware, keeps him in control for a few more hours. The woman watches, waits. When it becomes clear her father isn't going to die in the next 5 minutes, she leaves, doesn't say goodbye, doesn't touch him, just turns and walks out, her black dress rustling, her expression already smoothing back into neutral patience. Ezra stares after her. She's killing him. She's giving him what he wants, the figure says. More time, even if that time is agony, even if every moment is torture. He's still the Lord, still in control, still the man who signs the checks and owns the estates. As long as he's alive, she's nothing. A daughter waiting for permission to exist. The moment he dies, she inherits everything. So she waits, keeps him comfortable, gives him the medicines that keep him conscious and suffering because that's what he demands. Why doesn't she just... Ezra stops. Can't finish the sentence. Kill him? End it? Because then she'd be a murderer. This way, she's a dutiful daughter. Patient, long-suffering. Blameless, And when he finally dies, if he ever dies, no one will question her grief or her right to inherit. That's monstrous. That's wealth. That's what happens when you have so much you can't let go. When your identity is so completely tied to what you own that losing it feels like losing yourself. Like ceasing to exist. Lord Ashford's eyes are still open, still staring at the ceiling, searching for something. God, maybe, or proof that any of this mattered. That his life of accumulation and control and power meant something beyond the numbers in his accounts. He built an empire, the figure continues. 3 estates, hundreds of employees, shipping companies, trade routes across half the world. Made fortunes for himself and others. And do you know what he's thinking right now in this moment? No, that he should have built more. That he wasted time. That if he'd just worked harder, been smarter, acquired more, then maybe he'd have earned the right to live longer. That death is something you can negotiate with if you just have enough leverage. That's insane. That's capitalism. That's the logic of a world where your worth is measured by what you own. Where you're only as valuable as your last transaction. Where stopping even to die feels like failure. Ezra wants to argue. Wants to insist he's nothing like this wealthy, dying lord clinging to life out of greed and terror. But the words stick in his throat because he recognizes something in Lord Ashford's eyes. That desperate need for control. That refusal to surrender. That sense that if you just hold on tight enough, you can prevent the inevitable. He's been doing the same thing for 20 years. Not with money or property, but with numbness. With emotional distance. With the careful, deliberate construction of a life where nothing can hurt him because nothing can reach him. He's been dying too. Just slowly, quietly, in a way that society approves of because it looks like productivity, like self-sufficiency, like strength. You think I'm like him, Ezra says. Aren't you? I have nothing. No wealth. No power. No, you're clinging to control. To safety. To the belief that if you just refuse to feel, refuse to connect, refuse to hope, then loss can't touch you. You're doing exactly what he's doing. You've just been doing it longer. The room starts to dissolve. The furniture fading. The fire dimming. Lord Ashford's body becoming translucent, see-through, until all that's left are his eyes. Still staring. Still searching. Still refusing. He'll die alone, the figure says quietly. Surrounded by people who are waiting for him to finish. And in his last moment, if that moment ever comes, he'll realize that all the money, all the power, all the time he fought for, none of it made him less alone. None of it meant anything. The eyes disappear. Darkness. And Ezra realizes he's crying. When did that start? He doesn't know. Can't remember the last time he cried. His mother's funeral? Maybe. Or maybe never since. Maybe he's been holding back tears for 20 years, and they're only now finding their way out. I don't want to die like that, he whispers. Then don't. I don't want to die alone. Then stop choosing loneliness. The darkness clears, and Ezra is falling again. But this time, there's light below. Warm. Golden. Impossible. Let's talk about winter for a moment. Not metaphorical winter. Not the winter of the soul, or winter of discontent, or any other literary device. Actual winter. The meteorological phenomenon that happens every year and throughout most of human history killed a substantial percentage of the population because winter was a test. An annual, unavoidable test of whether you deserved to survive. Whether you had enough resources, enough preparation, enough luck. And Christmas, it's right in the middle of winter's darkest, coldest month. Right at the winter solstice, when the nights are longest and the sun seems like it might never return. This isn't coincidental. The date of Christmas, December 25th, has nothing to do with when Jesus was actually born. The Bible doesn't specify a date. Early Christians celebrated Christ's birth in spring, around Easter, which makes symbolic sense. Resurrection, rebirth, new life, all that theological alignment. But in the 4th century, the church made a strategic decision. They placed Christmas directly on top of existing pagan winter festivals. Saturnalia, Yule, Sol, Invictus, the Feast of the Unconquered Sun. Dozens of different celebrations all centered around the same primal fear and the same desperate hope. That darkness is temporary, that the sun will return, that we will survive this. The church co-opted those festivals, rebranded them, baptized them Christian. But the core remained the same. We are afraid. It is dark. It is cold. We might not make it. So let's light a fire and pretend we're not terrified. Christmas is primal. It's not really about Jesus, not at its heart. It's about survival, about defiance, about looking at the worst the world can throw at you and saying, not today. Today we feast. Today we sing. Today we act like we're going to live forever. It's a lie, obviously, a performance, but it's a necessary lie. Ezra understood this intellectually. That's why he hated Christmas so much. He saw the performance and called it hypocrisy. He saw the hope and called it delusion. He saw people celebrating in the face of suffering and thought, fools, cowards, liars. But what he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand until the figure showed him, was that the performance mattered because it was false. That the lie was the point. Think about it. You're a peasant in 1780. You work 12 hours a day in conditions that would violate every modern human rights law we've invented. You're cold. You're hungry. Your children are sick. Your parents are dying. You have no power, no agency, no reason whatsoever to believe tomorrow will be better than today. And then December comes. And someone, the church, the Lord, the community, whoever says, stop, rest, celebrate. It's a gift. Not a material gift. You're still poor, still cold, still hungry. But a psychological gift. Permission to stop merely surviving for one day and actually live. Permission to feel joy, even when there's no rational reason for joy. Permission to hope even when hope is mathematically unsound, even if it's fake. Even if tomorrow you'll be back in the cold and the hunger and the powerlessness. For one day, one single day, you get to pretend things are different. You get to remember what it feels like to be human instead of just a burden. And that pretending, that brief, flickering moment of joy, is what keeps you going. What keeps you alive through January and February and March when winter refuses to release its grip. This is the theology of Christmas. Not Christ, not redemption, not sin and salvation. Just this. It's okay to hope even when hope is irrational. It's okay to celebrate even when there's nothing to celebrate. It's okay to love even when love makes you vulnerable. It's okay to be human even when being human hurts. Ezra missed this for 20 years. Completely missed it. He saw the performance and called it hypocrisy because he couldn't see past his own pain. He saw people choosing joy in the face of suffering and thought they were stupid when actually they were braver than he'd ever been. Because it takes courage to hope when hope is unreasonable. It takes courage to love when love ends in loss. It takes courage to celebrate when the world is actively trying to kill you. Numbness is easy. Bitterness is safe. You can't be disappointed if you don't expect anything. You can't be hurt if you don't let anyone in. You can't lose what you never had. Joy is terrifying. Hope is terrifying. Love is terrifying because they require vulnerability. They require you to open yourself up to the possibility of loss, of pain, of having something precious and then watching it die in your arms while a choir sings about mercy and goodwill. Ezra chose safety. He chose numbness. He chose to protect himself so thoroughly that nothing could reach him, not pain, but also not joy. Not loss, but also not connection. He thought he was being smart, practical, realistic. He was just being a coward. And now, falling through darkness toward that impossible golden light, he's beginning to understand the cost of his cowardice. The price of safety. What he's actually been paying for 20 years of careful, controlled emptiness. He lands softly on snow again, but different this time, clean, white, untouched by soot or dirt or the grime of city life. He's in a forest. Ancient trees, heavy with ice, their branches creating a cathedral of white and shadow overhead. The air is still, silent, waiting. The figure is beside him. Has always been beside him, he realizes. Will always be beside him because the figure isn't separate. It's part of him. The part that still remembers how to feel. That still wants connection, even after everything. That's tired of being numb and is willing to risk everything for the chance. Just the chance of feeling something real again. One more vision, the figure says. The last one. And then you choose. Choose what? Ezra's voice is hoarse. Whether to go back. Whether to live. Whether to let yourself feel again, knowing it will hurt. Knowing you might lose everything. Knowing that hope is a risk you'll have to take every single day for the rest of your life. In the distance, through the trees, a light appears. Warm, golden, alive. Show me, Ezra whispers. And together Ezra and his shadow, the man and his ghost, the person he is and the person he could have been, they walk toward the light. The light resolves into a cottage. Small but sturdy, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and windows glowing amber against the blue-white snow. The sound of laughter drifts through cracks in the door, real laughter. Not performed, not polite, but genuine and messy and alive. Ezra stops walking. His boots sink into snow that makes no sound. Whose house is this? Yours, the figure says simply. I don't have a house. I rent a room above not now. Could've. This is the future you didn't choose. The life you rejected before it even had a chance to exist. Ezra's stomach drops. I don't understand. You will. The door opens before Ezra can protest. A woman steps out 40, maybe 45, with gray streaking through brown hair and laugh lines carved deep around her eyes. She's wearing an apron dusted with flour, and she's smiling at someone inside with an expression of such casual affection that it makes Ezra's chest ache. Dinner's ready, she calls. Come on, you'll let it get cold, and you know how the children complain. A man emerges from around the side of the cottage, older. Weathered by work and weather, but his eyes are bright, alive in a way that Ezra recognizes because he's seen it before in mirrors, in reflections, back when he was young and still believed the world might be kind. It's him. Not as he is now bitter, closed off, hollow, but as he could have been, would have been if he'd made different choices, if he'd been braver, if he'd been willing to risk pain for the possibility of joy. This other Ezra is smiling. Actually smiling, not the polite grimace he gives shopkeepers, but a real smile that transforms his entire face. He kisses the woman on the cheek, his wife, clearly, obviously, and follows her inside. And through the window, Ezra watches himself sit at a table surrounded by children. 3 of them. A girl of maybe 15, helping her mother serve food. A boy of 10 or 11, talking animatedly about something, hands gesturing wildly. A smaller child, 6, maybe, who crawls immediately into other Ezra's lap and stays there, comfortable and secure in a way that suggests this is routine, expected, safe. The family eats together, talks over each other in that chaotic way families do when affection is the baseline, when disagreement doesn't threaten connection. Other Ezra says something that makes everyone laugh. His wife swats his arm playfully. The oldest child rolls her eyes, but she's smiling. The youngest steals food from his plate, and he pretends not to notice. It's ordinary, mundane, nothing special or extraordinary about it. It's the most beautiful thing Ezra has ever seen. "This isn't real," he says, but his voice cracks on the words. "This is a fantasy, a trick." "Aye, it's as real as anything else," the figure interrupts. "It's a possibility, one of many. This is what happens if you let her in." "Let who in?" The figure gestures toward the cottage. The woman is visible through the window now, laughing at something her husband said, her hand reaching across the table to squeeze his. "Her name is Margaret," the figure says. "You met her 6 years ago. She works at the bakery on your street. Every morning you buy bread from her. Every morning she smiles at you, asks about your day, tries to make conversation while you count out exact change and leave as quickly as possible." Ezra remembers, vaguely, a woman who talks too much, who asks intrusive questions, who he's always polite to but never engages with because engagement leads to conversation, and conversation leads to connection, and connection leads to... "You could have asked her to dinner," the figure continues. "Any time in the last 6 years. She would have said yes. You would have talked, laughed, discovered you had more in common than you thought. And slowly, so slowly you wouldn't notice until it was too late. You would have fallen in love." "I don't fall in love. You did once. With the idea of a better world. With your mother's faith. With the possibility that things could be different. You're capable of it. You're just too afraid to try." Inside the cottage, the family is finishing their meal now. The children are arguing about whose turn it is to do dishes. Other Ezra is mediating with exaggerated seriousness. His wife is already clearing plates, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more and finds comfort in the repetition. Real Ezra can't look away, can't breathe, can't process what he's seeing because it's too much, too possible, too close to something he didn't even know he wanted until this moment. "This is what you gave up," the figure says quietly. "Not because you couldn't have it, not because you weren't worthy, but because you were too scared to try, too convinced that loss was inevitable. So why bother risking happiness at all? It wouldn't have worked," Ezra says desperately. "I would have. I'm not good enough, not kind enough. According to whom? Who decided you weren't worthy of love? Who wrote that law and carved it into stone? Everyone. The world, reality. My mother died. My father died. Everyone I've ever cared about has. So you decided to stop caring before anyone else could leave. You decided loneliness was safer than risk. You chose this, Ezra. Every day for 20 years you chose this. The scene shifts without warning. The cottage dissolves. The family fades. And suddenly Ezra is standing in a graveyard. It's spring. The trees are blooming. Birds singing. The world aggressively, offensively alive in a way that feels like mockery. There's a funeral happening, small, sparse, barely attended. A handful of people gather around a grave, and they don't look particularly sad. More like they're fulfilling an obligation, checking a box, being seen to do the right thing before they can leave and forget. Ezra walks closer. The snow makes no sound beneath his feet because snow doesn't exist here. In this vision of a future that hasn't happened yet but will inevitably, unless something changes. He reads the headstone. Ezra Scrooge, 1737 to 1803. He worked hard. That's it. No beloved husband or cherished father or dearly missed. No list of accomplishments or virtues. Just 4 words that summarize an entire life. He worked hard. The people at the funeral are co-workers. Ezra recognizes them vaguely, faces from the office. People he's worked alongside for years without ever really knowing. They're not crying. Not even particularly sad. Just there. Present. They'll leave soon, go back to their lives, and by dinner, they'll have forgotten him entirely. One of them checks a pocket watch. Another stifles a yawn. A third is already turning away, clearly eager to leave, to get back to the living world where this dead man won't make them uncomfortable anymore. This is the future you did choose, the figure says. Ezra stares at his own grave, at the pathetic, insufficient summary of a life spent avoiding life, at the absolute absence of impact, of meaning, of anyone who will remember him as anything more than that clerk who never smiled. Is this supposed to scare me? He asks, but his voice shakes so badly the words barely emerge. Is it working? It is. God help him, it is. Because Ezra has spent 20 years telling himself that safety is enough, that survival equals success, that as long as he doesn't feel pain, he's winning. But this empty grave, this perfunctory funeral, this absolute confirmation that he'll die exactly as alone as he's lived, this is what winning looks like. And it's unbearable. The graveyard dissolves slowly this time. Not all at once, not dramatically, but like fog burning off in morning sun. The trees fade first, then the mourners, then the headstone itself, until all that remains is Ezra standing in whiteness, in nothingness, in a space between what was and what could be. And he's crying, actually crying. Tears streaming down his face, shoulders shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps that sound like something breaking. When did this start? He can't remember. Can't remember the last time he cried, actually. His mother's funeral, maybe, or maybe never since. Maybe he's been holding back tears for 20 years, and they're only now finding their way out, forcing their way through all his carefully constructed defenses. I don't know how to change, he whispers. His voice sounds destroyed, raw, like something that's been buried too long and has finally clawed its way to the surface. Yes, you do, the figure says. It's standing directly in front of him now, close enough to touch, if either of them were solid enough for touching. You've known the whole time. You just didn't want to admit it. I'll fail. I'll try and I'll fail, and I'll end up hurt and alone anyway. That's how it always ends. That's how it has to end. Probably, the figure agrees, and there's something almost kind in its layered voice. You'll probably fail. You'll definitely get hurt. You might end up alone. Those are the risks. Those are what you're afraid of. Then why would I? But at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have lived. At least when you die, and you will die. Ezra, everyone dies. You'll die having been human, having felt something, having mattered to someone. That's not enough. It's everything. The whiteness around them begins to shift, to crystallize. And Ezra realizes they're not in nowhere anymore. They're back on London Bridge. The snowstorm has stopped. The city is silent, holding its breath, waiting for Christmas morning. The sky is that strange pre-dawn gray that's neither night nor day, and the first bells are beginning to ring in the distance. The figure is fading, becoming translucent, see-through, not leaving so much as being absorbed back into wherever it came from. Back into Ezra himself, probably. Back into the part of him that still remembers how to hope. Wait, Ezra says. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to be. Different. You don't have to know. You just have to start. Start where? Anywhere. Everywhere. With the next choice you make. With the next person you see. With Margaret at the bakery, or Jacob in that terrible room, or the girl with the gingerbread. With any of the 1,000 small moments where you can choose connection instead of safety. What if I choose wrong? There is no wrong. There's only choosing or not choosing. Trying or not trying. Being alive or being a ghost. The figure is almost gone now. Just an outline. A suggestion. A possibility. You called me here, it says. You wrote those letters to yourself. You came to this bridge because some part of you, some small, desperate part, still believes things can be different. Still wants to be different. So be different. Choose differently. Tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. Until choosing becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. I'm scared. I know. Be scared anyway. The figure disappears. And Ezra is alone on London Bridge with the snow crunching beneath his boots and his heart, pounding so hard he can feel it in his throat, in his fingertips, in every part of him that's been numb for so long he'd forgotten what feeling felt like. He looks down at his hands. They're shaking. He doesn't try to stop them. He looks out at London, at the frozen Thames glittering in the pre-dawn light, at the buildings emerging from darkness, at the city that's killed so many people and will kill so many more, but is also, somehow, still beautiful, still worth something, still full of people trying their best to survive and occasionally, miraculously, succeeding. The bells are ringing louder now. Christmas morning, the day when London pretends everything is possible. And Ezra realizes something. The figure was right. He did write those letters to himself. Not literally, not consciously, but in the way that drowning people reach for air without thinking about it. He'd been suffocating in his own numbness for so long that some part of him finally rebelled, finally demanded change, finally called for help in the only way it knew how, by showing him what he'd become, what he'd lost, what he still had the chance to choose. He could go back to his room right now. Go back to his ledgers and his empty routine and his safe, controlled, suffocating existence. He could pretend tonight never happened, that it was just a fever dream brought on by cold and exhaustion. He could keep being exactly who he's been for 20 years. Or he could walk toward Margaret's bakery, could knock on her door, even though it's barely dawn on Christmas morning, and she'll think he's insane. Could say what? What would he even say? I bought gingerbread for a starving child, and it broke something in me, and I don't know how to be a person anymore, but I'd like to learn. That sounds insane. That is insane. But the alternative, going back, staying numb, remaining a ghost, is suddenly more terrifying than any amount of potential rejection or embarrassment or pain. So Ezra starts walking, not confidently, not with any certainty about what he's doing or what will happen. His legs feel weak. His breath comes too fast. Every instinct he has is screaming at him to turn around, to retreat, to choose safety over risk. But he keeps walking, down off the bridge, through streets just beginning to wake, past vendors setting up early, past a few drunken stragglers from last night's celebrations, past a family heading to church and a beggar curled in a doorway, and all the ordinary, extraordinary chaos of a city coming to life on Christmas morning. He walks for 20 minutes, 30. Almost turns back a dozen times. But he doesn't. And then he's standing outside the bakery. Margaret's bakery. Dark now, obviously. It's barely dawn. She won't be up yet. Won't be expecting anyone. This is ridiculous. This is the door opens. Margaret is standing there in a nightgown and shawl, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes wide with surprise. She must have seen him through the window. Must have been confused by the sight of her most punctual, most distant customer standing outside her shop at dawn on Christmas morning. "Ezra," she says, "what are you doing here? It's Christmas. Are you all right?" And Ezra realizes he's crying again. When did that start? He doesn't know, doesn't care. Just stands there on her doorstep with tears freezing on his cheeks and his hands shaking and his heart pounding, and manages to say, in a voice that barely works, "I don't know how to do this, but I'd like to learn." Margaret doesn't ask what this means, doesn't laugh or look confused or close the door in his face. She just studies him for a long moment, really looks at him, maybe for the first time and then steps aside. "Come in," she says quietly. "You'll freeze out there." And Ezra, the first Grinch, the man who hated Christmas, the person who spent 20 years building walls so high he forgot what the world looked like without them, steps inside. But let's pause here. Step back from Ezra standing in Margaret's doorway with his defenses crumbling and his future uncertain. Because before we finish his story, we need to understand something crucial about Christmas itself, about what it actually is, beneath all the tinsel and theology and cultural performance. Christmas, as we know it, is a lie. Not in a cynical way. Not in a shallow, haha, Santa isn't real way that teenagers discover and think makes them sophisticated. But in a deeper, more fundamental way. Almost nothing we associate with Christmas is actually about Christmas. The tree? Pagan. Ancient Germanic tribes brought evergreen branches inside during winter solstice as symbols of life persisting through darkness. Christians adopted it in the 16th century, rebranded it, called it a paradise tree, representing the Garden of Eden. The gift-giving? Romang. Saturnalia involved exchanging presents as symbols of good fortune. Small gifts, usually candles, nuts, figurines. The practice had nothing to do with a baby in Bethlehem, and everything to do with acknowledging social bonds before winter killed you. The feast? Medieval European tradition. A rare break from near starvation, when lords would open their halls to vassals, and everyone could pretend for one day that the brutally hierarchical feudal system was actually a big, happy family. The caroling? British working-class tradition. And here's what they don't teach you in school. Carolers weren't spreading cheer. They were demanding tribute. "We wish you a Merry Christmas" literally includes the line, "Bring us some figgy pudding and bring it right here." That wasn't a request. It was a threat. "Give us food and drink or we'll keep singing outside your house until you do." Caroling was polite extortion dressed up as festivity. Even the date, December 25th, is arbitrary, almost certainly wrong. Jesus wasn't born in December. The Bible mentions shepherds tending flocks at night, which doesn't happen in Judean winter. The December date was chosen specifically to override pagan festivals, to claim the darkest time of year for Christianity instead of for the old gods. Everything we think of as traditional Christmas is actually a hodgepodge of stolen traditions, strategic appropriations, and cultural evolution spanning 2,000 years. And the version we recognize today, the sentimental, family-focused, gift-exchanging, emotion-laden cultural juggernaut, was essentially invented by Charles Dickens in 1843. Think about that. Charles Dickens is more responsible for modern Christmas than Jesus Christ. Before A Christmas Carol, Christmas in England was dying. The Puritans had nearly killed it in the 17th century with their bans and their stern insistence that joy was sinful. The Industrial Revolution was finishing the job. Factories didn't close for holidays. Workers couldn't afford celebrations, and the wealthy had mostly abandoned Christmas as old-fashioned and unsophisticated. Then Dickens published his little book about Ebenezer Scrooge, and it became a sensation. Not because it was particularly original. The plot is basically just Christian morality play plus Victorian sentimentality, but because it gave people permission to care again. Permission to believe that Christmas could be about more than just survival, that it could be about connection, redemption, transformation. A Christmas Carol made Christmas matter, made it feel necessary, made it into the cultural institution we recognize today. But here's what's fascinating. Dickens didn't invent Ebenezer Scrooge. He formalized him, gave him a name and a narrative and a redemption arc. But the archetype, the man who hates Christmas, who sees through its pretensions, who refuses to participate in the collective delusion that existed long before Dickens wrote about it. Ezra Scrooge existed, not as an individual maybe, but as a type. as a response to a holiday that promised what it couldn't deliver, that asked people to celebrate in the face of suffering, to hope despite evidence, to believe in human goodness when human cruelty was the daily reality. The Grinch wasn't created by Dr. Seuss in 1957. He's been around as long as Christmas has. As long as there have been people who looked at enforced celebration and said, "No, I see what you're doing. I see the performance. I refuse to participate." And society has always hated them for it. Always treated Christmas resistance as a moral failing, a character flaw, evidence of a cold heart or damaged soul. But why? Why is refusing to celebrate treated as villainy? Why is questioning the holiday's premises considered cruel? Why do we insist with increasing desperation each year that everyone must participate, must feel the same things, must perform the same rituals? Because Christmas is how we lie to ourselves about power. Think about it. For most of human history, winter was when the poor died and the rich survived. When class distinctions became literally, fatally obvious. When the fundamental injustice of society was impossible to ignore because you could see it in the frozen bodies on the streets. Christmas was the pressure valve. The moment when the wealthy would perform generosity, throw a feast, give some alms, invite the poor to sing carols outside their warm houses. Not enough generosity to actually change anything. Just enough to make people feel like the system cared. Like their suffering was seen, acknowledged, regretted. And then January would come and everything would go back to normal. The poor would go back to dying. The wealthy would go back to accumulating. And Christmas would be remembered as proof that people were fundamentally good. That society had a conscience, that things weren't really as bad as they seemed in that one moment of shared humanity. It's brilliant, really. Christmas allows us to acknowledge inequality without addressing it, to feel generous without redistributing resources, to perform goodwill without actual structural change. That's why Christmas skeptics are treated as villains, because they're pointing out that the emperor has no clothes, that the holiday's promises are hollow, that one day of enforced kindness doesn't erase 364 days of systematic cruelty. The Grinch isn't the villain of the Christmas story. He's the truth teller, the person who won't play along, who looks at the who's down in Hovel singing around their tree and says, "This doesn't fix anything. This doesn't change anything. This is just performance." And he's right. But when this is crucial, he's also wrong. Because the performance matters. Not because it changes material conditions. Not because it redistributes wealth or challenges power structures. But because it keeps people alive. Psychologically alive. Spiritually alive. It gives them one day to remember what joy feels like, what connection feels like, what it means to be human instead of just a unit of labor. Is that enough? No, obviously not. But it's not nothing. This is what Ezra is beginning to understand as he stands in Margaret's doorway. That Christmas isn't about fixing the world. It's about surviving the world. About creating small moments of light in the darkness. About choosing connection, even when connection is risky, even when it makes you vulnerable, even when it might end in loss. The holiday is a lie, but it's a lie that makes truth bearable. It's performance. But performance is how we learn to be the people we want to be. It's not enough. But nothing is ever enough, and we have to start somewhere. Ezra spent 20 years refusing to start, insisting that if he couldn't fix everything, he wouldn't try anything. That if hope was sometimes disappointed, he'd never hope at all. That if love could end in loss, he'd never love. And it nearly killed him. Not physically, he's still breathing, still functioning. But in every way that matters, he's been dead for 20 years. A ghost haunting his own life. Until tonight. Until a snowstorm that shouldn't exist, and a figure without a face, and 3 visions that showed. Him what he'd already known but refused to acknowledge. That safety isn't living. That control isn't peace. That protecting yourself from pain also protects you from everything that makes life worth enduring. "Come in," Margaret says again, because Ezra is still standing on her threshold, frozen, unable to quite believe he's actually here, that he actually did this impossible, terrifying thing. He steps inside. The door closes behind him, and the warmth of her home modest, simple, nothing like Lord Ashford's tomb of a bedroom, but infinitely more alive hits him like a physical force. "Sit," Margaret says, gesturing to a chair by her fireplace. "I'll make tea. You don't have to. I know I don't have to." "Sit." He sits, watches her move around the small kitchen, stoking the fire, filling a kettle, pulling down cups. She doesn't ask questions, doesn't demand explanations. Just lets him be there, shaking and overwhelmed and more vulnerable than he's been in 2 decades. Finally, she brings 2 cups of tea, sits across from him, studies his face in the firelight. "Bad night?" she asks quietly. Ezra laughs. It sounds broken. "Bad 20 years. Margaret doesn't look surprised. Just nods like this makes perfect sense. "And you came here because I'm tired," Ezra says. The words come easier than he expected. Maybe because he's too exhausted to guard them anymore. "I'm so tired of being alone, of pretending I don't need anyone, of acting like safety is the same as living." "It's not?" "No, it's just slower dying." They sit in silence for a moment. The fire crackles. Outside, church bells are ringing more insistently now. Christmas morning fully arrived. The city waking up to perform its annual ritual of hope. "I don't know what I'm doing," Ezra admits. "I don't know how to be with people anymore. I'll probably be terrible at it. I'll definitely disappoint you." "Probably," Margaret agrees, but she's smiling slightly. "Does that mean you're not going to try?" And Ezra realizes with a clarity that feels like revelation that this is the choice. Not once, but constantly. Every day. Every moment. The choice to try even when trying is hard. Even when failure is likely. Even when the outcome is uncertain. The choice to be human. "No," he says quietly. "I'm going to try." Here's what they don't tell you about transformation. The decision is the easy part. Ezra sits in Margaret's kitchen on Christmas morning, drinking tea, making promises he's not sure he can keep. And in the moment, in that warm, fire-lit space with a woman who's shown him more kindness in 10 minutes than he's experienced in years, it feels possible. It feels like he's already changed. Like the hard part is over and everything else will just naturally follow. It doesn't work that way. The hard part is tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The hard part is every single moment when your old patterns reassert themselves, when your defenses snap back into place, when the vulnerability that felt brave at dawn feels stupid by afternoon. Ezra and Margaret talk for 2 hours that Christmas morning, about nothing, mostly small things. The bakery, the weather, books they've read. It's awkward. Ezra is out of practice with conversation, with letting someone see him, with the basic mechanics of human connection. He gives one-word answers sometimes, goes silent for minutes at a stretch, watches Margaret's face for signs that she's regretting inviting him in, but she doesn't seem to regret it. She just keeps talking, keeps asking gentle questions, keeps treating him like someone worth knowing instead of like a project to fix or a problem to solve. Finally, when the bells have stopped ringing and the city is fully awake, and Ezra has exhausted his small reserve of social energy, he stands. "I should go." "All right," Margaret says. She walks him to the door, doesn't ask when she'll see him again, doesn't extract promises or commitments, just says, "Thank you for coming by. Thank you for not turning me away. I wouldn't have done that. You should have. I am human, Margaret finishes. You're human, Ezra. That's allowed. He walks home through streets full of families heading to Christmas dinners. Children playing in the snow. The whole choreographed performance of holiday cheer. And instead of hating it, instead of feeling that familiar contempt and bitterness, he just feels tired. And maybe just slightly hopeful. He sleeps for 12 hours. Dreams of bridges and frozen rivers and a figure without a face telling him to wake up. When he wakes, it's December 26th. Boxing Day. The day after Christmas when everyone goes back to normal and pretends they're still feeling generous while actually just wanting the holiday to be over. And Ezra's first thought is, what was I thinking? Because in daylight, in the cold clarity of his rented room, the whole thing feels absurd. Going to Margaret's house at dawn, crying on her doorstep, confessing to being lonely like that's something novel or interesting instead of just pathetic. What must she think of him? What must everyone think of him? He should apologize, explain that he was tired, that he'd had a strange night, that he wasn't himself. He should go back to his normal routine, his normal carefully controlled existence, and never mention it again. That's what his mind tells him. That's what 20 years of habit insists. But he promised. Not explicitly, maybe, but implicitly. He'd promised to try. He promised not to run back to safety the moment things got uncomfortable. So instead of retreating, Ezra does something small. He goes to the bakery the next morning, same as always. But instead of counting out exact change and leaving immediately, he says, "Thank you for yesterday." Margaret smiles. "You're welcome. For what it's worth, you weren't as terrible at conversation as you think you were. I was terrible. You were out of practice. That's different. It's a tiny interaction. 30 seconds, maybe. But it takes everything Ezra has not to run. The next day, he goes back. And the day after that. And slowly, so slowly, he barely notices. The conversations get slightly easier. Slightly longer. Slightly less painful. 3 weeks later, he asks Margaret to dinner again. This time at a proper restaurant, not at dawn in her kitchen while he's having an existential crisis. She says yes. The dinner is still awkward. Ezra still doesn't know how to make small talk. Still goes silent at odd moments. Still watches her like he's waiting for her to realize he's not worth the effort. But she stays. Keeps talking. Keeps showing up. 6 months later, they're seeing each other regularly. Not formally courting. That would be too fast, too presumptuous. Just spending time together. Walking. Talking. Existing in the same space without it feeling like torture. And Ezra is still struggling. Still has days when he wants to retreat. When vulnerability feels unbearable. When the old numbness calls to him like a siren song, promising safety if he'll just give up this exhausting business of being human. Margaret notices. Of course, she notices. She's patient, remarkably patient, but she's not a saint. There are arguments. Days when Ezra shuts down completely, and she has to decide whether to push or give him space. Days when she's hurt by his distance and tells him so, and he has to learn how to apologize, how to explain, how to try harder. It's messy. It's hard. It's nothing like the vision on London Bridge, where other Ezra seemed to have figured everything out, where love was comfortable and family was easy, and transformation was complete. Real transformation isn't complete. It's ongoing. It's a practice, not a destination. 1 year later, Ezra asks Margaret to marry him. He does it badly awkward, stuttering, not even properly on one knee because his joints hurt and he's not young anymore. But he means it, and she says yes. 2 years after that, they have their first child. A girl. Ezra is 46 years old. Terrified, completely unprepared for fatherhood. He's not naturally good at it. He's too stiff, too formal, too afraid of doing something wrong. But he tries. Every day, he tries. The child grows. Then another child. Then a third. And Ezra grows with them slowly, painfully, with constant setbacks and failures and moments when he reverts to his old self and has to consciously choose to be different. But he keeps choosing. That's the thing. He keeps choosing vulnerability over safety, connection over control, hope over cynicism. Not because it's easy, not because it always works, but because the alternative, going back to being a ghost, is no longer tolerable. This is what redemption actually looks like. Not a dramatic transformation on one magical night, but years of small daily choices. Years of falling down and getting back up. Years of being human in all its messy, imperfect, exhausting glory. 10 years after that night on London Bridge, Ezra Scrooge is 53 years old. He has a wife he loves, 3 children who drive him to distraction, a cottage that's too small and too loud and more alive than any space he inhabited in his first 43 years of existence. He's not a different person. He's still reserved, still awkward in social situations, still prone to withdrawal when things get overwhelming. But he's learned to recognize those patterns, to name them, to choose differently when it matters. Christmas is still complicated for him. The holiday still carries the weight of his mother's death, his father's grief, all those years of bitter observation. But he participates now, decorates the tree with his children, attends church with Margaret, even sings carols badly because his daughter insists, and he's learned that making his children laugh is worth the embarrassment. On Christmas Eve, 1850, Ezra is walking through London with his oldest daughter, 15 now, sharp as a whip, too clever for her own good. They're delivering food to families in need. It's become a tradition, started by Margaret years ago and continued by the whole family. Nothing dramatic or self-congratulatory. Just taking baskets to people who might otherwise go hungry. They approach a building Ezra recognizes but can't quite place. A boarding house in a poor neighborhood. They climb stairs to a third-floor room, and when the door opens, Ezra sees her. The girl from the Frost Fair, the one who stole gingerbread. Except she's not a girl anymore. She's a woman now, 22 or 23, and she's holding an infant. She recognizes him instantly. Her eyes go wide. Mr. Scrooge? Ezra stares. Can't quite process this. You remember me? Of course I remember you. You bought me gingerbread when I was starving. You saved my life. I didn't, it was one piece of gingerbread. I hardly. It was enough to keep me alive that night. And the next day, I found work because I had energy to look for it. And that work led to other work. And she gestures around the small but clean room. I'm still here. Because of you. Ezra feels something tighten in his chest. Pride? Discomfort? Some mixture of both? I'm glad you're well, he manages. They deliver the basket. Leave. And as they walk home through snow that's falling softly, prettily, without the murderous intent of 1780, Ezra's daughter says, You never told me that story. It wasn't a story. It was nothing. It wasn't nothing to her. Ezra doesn't answer. Just keeps walking. But he's thinking about that night on the frozen Thames. About a small act of kindness he dismissed as meaningless. About how you never know what ripples you create, what lives you touch, what difference you make simply by choosing to be human when it would be easier to turn away. That night, after the children are in bed and the house is quiet, Margaret finds him sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She sits beside him, doesn't ask what he's thinking after 10 years of marriage. She can usually guess. It matters, she says quietly. What you did, who you became, it all matters. Sometimes, Ezra says. Sometimes I think I'm still the same person. Still that bitter man on the bridge. Just better at pretending. That's not pretending. That's changing. That's what change looks like. You doing the right thing even when part of you wants to do the wrong thing. That's not fake. That's character. Ezra leans into her, lets himself be comforted. It's still hard sometimes accepting comfort, believing he deserves it. But it gets easier. Year by year, day by day, it gets easier. Do you ever regret it? He asks. Letting me in that morning? Margaret laughs. Every day. Margaret. I'm joking. Mostly. She kisses his temple. You're difficult, Ezra. You always have been. You probably always will be. But you're worth it. You're worth the difficulty. It's the simplest thing. The smallest affirmation. But it settles something in Ezra that's been unsettled for 50 years. This idea that he's worth it. Worth effort. Worth patience. Worth love. Not because he's perfect. Not because he fixed everything that was broken. But because he's trying. Because he's choosing. Because he's human. That night, Ezra dreams of the bridge again. Of the figure without a face. But this time, when he looks at it, he recognizes who it is. It's him. Always was. The part of him that refused to die completely. That kept hope alive through 20 years of numbness. That called himself back from the edge when he was ready to give up entirely. The figure speaks. You did it. You chose. I almost didn't, but you did. That's what matters. Will it always be this hard? Yes, but you'll get better at hard. You already have. Ezra wakes up. Margaret is asleep beside him. Through the wall, he can hear one of the children stirring. Morning is coming. Christmas morning. Another year of trying. Another year of choosing to be human despite everything that makes being human difficult. He gets up quietly, starts the fire, puts on water for tea. Small rituals, small choices, small ways of saying, I'm still here. I'm still trying. I'm still alive. When Margaret comes downstairs, she finds him standing at the window, watching snow fall on a city that's changed so much and not at all since that night 10 years ago. She wraps her arms around him from behind. Doesn't say anything. Doesn't need to, and Ezra thinks, this is enough. Not perfect, not complete, not everything he might have wanted, but enough, more than enough, more than he ever thought he'd deserve or receive. This is what winning looks like. Not a dramatic transformation, not a magical cure, just life. Ordinary, messy, beautiful life, shared with someone who sees him completely and chooses him anyway. Surrounded by children who will never know how close he came to missing all of this. This is what the Grinch learns in the end. Not that Christmas is magical or that problems are solved by believing hard enough, but that connection is worth the risk. That vulnerability is worth the pain. That being human is worth the unbearable difficulty of actually living. Outside, bells begin to ring. Christmas morning, he's ready. Ezra Scrooge died in 1803, at the age of 66. Relatively young by modern standards, respectable for his era. He died in his own bed, in the cottage he shared with Margaret, surrounded by children and grandchildren, having lived 33 years longer than that frozen night on London Bridge when he very nearly chose to remain a ghost forever. History forgot him almost immediately. There's no record of Ezra Scrooge in any archive. No memoirs or letters preserved in libraries. No headstone you can visit. The churchyard where he was buried was demolished in 1865 to make room for a railway station. No one wrote about him. No one remembered him beyond his immediate family. And eventually, even they forgot the details of who he was, what he struggled with, how close he came to losing everything before he found anything. By 1843, 40 years after his death, when Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol, no one living had ever heard of Ezra Scrooge. The name was just coincidence. Or maybe not coincidence, maybe Dickens had heard the name somewhere, Third hand, fourth hand, distorted through decades of retelling until only the sound remained. But the archetype? The man who hated Christmas and learned to love it again? That wasn't Dickens's invention. That was Ezra's legacy. His story, stripped of specifics, worn smooth by repetition, transformed into myth. Because here's the thing about stories. They have a life beyond the people who live them. They evolve, adapt, become bigger than their origins. What actually happened to one bitter clerk in London in 1780 becomes what could happen to anyone, anywhere, who's forgotten how to feel and needs to remember. Dickens' Scrooge is visited by three ghosts. Ezra's version involved one figure with many voices, or maybe no figure at all, just his own psyche staged as supernatural intervention, because that's the only way he could hear what he needed to hear. Dickens' Scrooge transforms overnight. Ezra's transformation took years, decades, a lifetime of daily choices to be different, to try again, to keep choosing vulnerability over safety. Dickens' Scrooge becomes a saint, beloved by everyone, generous to a fault, the embodiment of Christmas spirit. Ezra reigned difficult, complicated, someone who tried hard but didn't always succeed, someone who loved his family but wasn't naturally affectionate, someone who participated in Christmas but never quite lost the shadow of grief that the holiday carried for him. Which version is more honest? Which version actually helps people? The sanitized fairy tale or the messy reality? Both, probably. We need both. We need the fairy tale to show us that change is possible. And we need the reality to show us that change is hard, that it's okay to struggle. That transformation doesn't mean becoming someone else entirely. It just means becoming more yourself, more human, more willing to engage with the world, despite knowing the world can hurt you. Ezra's story didn't end on London Bridge. It didn't end in Margaret's kitchen. It didn't even end with his death. It ended, or rather, continued, every time someone heard a version of it and thought, maybe I could try too. Maybe I could choose differently. Maybe it's not too late for me. That girl with the gingerbread? She told the story to her children, about the strange man who bought her food when she was starving. How that one act of kindness changed the trajectory of her entire life. How you never know what small gesture might save someone. Her children told their children, and the story shifted, simplified, became about generosity, about Christmas spirit, about the importance of helping those in need. The specific details, Ezra's bitterness, his struggle, his very nearly not helping at all, those got lost. But the core remained. Choose kindness, even when it's hard, even when you don't want to, because it matters. Margaret told a different version. To friends, to neighbors, to people who noticed how her husband was distant sometimes, withdrawn, clearly struggling with something. She'd say, he's had a hard life, but he's trying. That's what matters. He's trying. And people would nod. And maybe some of them would think about their own difficulties, their own struggles with connection and vulnerability. Maybe some of them would try a little harder too. The children, Ezra's children, they told the story as family mythology. About their father who used to hate Christmas, but learned to love it. About how he was never naturally warm, but made the effort anyway. About how love isn't always easy or natural, but it's always worth it. None of these versions are complete. None of them capture the full complexity of what actually happened on that bridge, in that snowstorm. During those visions that might have been supernatural, or might have been psychological break, or might have been something in between. But all of them are true. All of them carry some essential piece of what Ezra learned and lived and passed on. That change is possible. That vulnerability is strength. That hope is a choice you make every day, not a feeling that descends upon you magically. That being human is hard and painful and worth it. By the time Dr. Seuss wrote How the Grinch Stole Christmas in 1957, the archetype was fully formed. The character who hates Christmas, who sees its falseness and commercialism and hypocrisy, who stands outside the celebration judging everyone for participating in something so obviously hollow, and then learns through whatever mechanism the story employs that the celebration isn't the point. The connection is the point. The choosing to be together despite everything that makes being together difficult. That's the point. Seuss's Grinch learns this from the Who's singing without presents. Dickens' Scrooge learns it from supernatural intervention. Ezra learned it from his own desperation, from hitting a point where numbness was more terrifying than vulnerability, from the part of himself that refused to let him die a ghost. The mechanism doesn't matter. The lesson is the same. You can change. You should change. It's hard and it's scary, and it won't fix everything, but it's worth it anyway. That's Ezra's legacy. Not his name history forgot that. Not the specific details of his life. Those are gone. But the idea. The archetype. The story of the man who hated Christmas and learned to love it again. Not because Christmas became better, but because he became brave enough to engage with it anyway. That story, that possibility, that's what survives. That's what matters. That's what makes Ezra Scrooge, forgotten clerk, dead for 2 centuries, more alive than most people who still breathe. Because stories don't die. They just change form. And as long as someone needs to hear that change is possible, Ezra's story will keep being told. So why does this matter now? Why tell this story in 2025 about events from 1780 filtered through Victorian literature and mid-century children's books? Because we're all Ezra now. Look around. Look at the world we've built. We're more connected than any humans in history. We carry devices that let us communicate with anyone, anywhere, instantly. We have access to more information, more entertainment, more stimulation than any previous generation could have imagined. And we're lonelier than we've ever been. Rates of depression, anxiety, isolation, all climbing steadily. Fewer friends, fewer close relationships, fewer people we can call in a crisis. We're surrounded by other humans, but increasingly separate from them, locked behind screens and algorithms and carefully curated personas that show everyone how fine we are while hiding how much we're struggling. We've become a civilization of Ezras, protecting ourselves so thoroughly from potential pain that we've also protected ourselves from everything that makes life worth living. And Christmas, modern Christmas, has become part of the problem. It's not about connection anymore, not really. It's about consumption, about buying the right things, decorating perfectly, staging the perfect family gathering for Instagram, about performing joy rather than feeling it, about maintaining appearances while quietly drowning in debt and obligation, and the exhausting effort of pretending everything is fine. The holiday that was supposed to create connection now just highlights its absence. You scroll through social media on Christmas and see everyone else's perfect celebrations and feel worse about your own imperfect, messy reality. You go to family gatherings and make small talk with people you barely know anymore, people you're related to by blood, but not by genuine connection. You work retail and watch people literally fight over discounted televisions while talking about peace on Earth. You see the homeless population spike every December because winter is still killing people. Poverty is still real, and one day of performative charity doesn't change structural inequality. And you think, Ezra was right. This is all performance. All hypocrisy. Why participate in something so obviously hollow? This is the modern Grinch, not someone who's cruel or heartless, just someone who's paying attention, who sees the gap between what we say we value and what we actually do. Who's tired of pretending that buying things equals loving people, that busyness equals connection, that any of this performative nonsense means anything real. And that person, that modern Grinch, they're not wrong. They're just incomplete. Because yes, Christmas is commercial and hypocritical and often hollow. Yes, it's been co-opted by capitalism and turned into an engine of consumption. Yes, the gap between Christmas ideals and Christmas reality is vast and growing. But, the need it's trying to address is still real. The human hunger for connection, for meaning, for moments of transcendence in a world that mostly feels mundane and difficult. That's still real, still valid, still worth addressing, even if our current methods are imperfect. The question isn't whether Christmas is flawed. Of course it's flawed. Everything humans create is flawed because humans are flawed. The question is, what are you going to do about it? You can be Ezra on the bridge, isolated, bitter, technically correct about everything, and profoundly unhappy. Seeing all the problems, refusing all the solutions, protecting yourself so well that nothing can reach you. Or you can be Ezra after the bridge, imperfect, struggling, making the daily choice to engage anyway, to create connection even when connection is commercialized, to find meaning even when meaning is marketed, to love people even when loving people is hard. This doesn't mean embracing mindless consumerism. It doesn't mean pretending the problems don't exist. It means acknowledging them and choosing to create something better anyway, in your own life, in your own small sphere of influence. It means calling that friend you've been meaning to call, actually calling, not just texting, actually having a conversation that goes deeper than surface pleasantries. It means showing up for people even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient, because convenience is the enemy of connection. Real relationships require effort, time, vulnerability, all the things our modern world has trained us to avoid. It means being honest about your struggles instead of performing perfection, letting people see you as you actually are, not as you think you should be. Because vulnerability creates space for others to be vulnerable too, and that's where real connection lives. It means choosing presence over productivity, putting down the phone during dinner, actually listening instead of just waiting for your turn to talk, being where you are instead of constantly planning where you'll be next. It means accepting that you will fail at this constantly, that you'll retreat into old patterns, choose safety over risk, close off when you meant to open up, and then choosing to try again anyway. This is what the Grinch story is actually about. Not about learning to love Christmas, about learning to love the messy, imperfect, difficult business of being human with other humans. The Who's in Whoville don't stop singing when the Grinch steals their presents. Not because they're naive or stupid or missing the point, but because the presents were never the point. The singing, the connection, the choosing to be together, the creating of meaning in the face of meaninglessness, that's the point. And the Grinch's heart growing 3 sizes isn't about becoming a different person. It's about letting himself feel again, letting himself connect again, letting himself be vulnerable to joy and pain and all the complicated emotions that come with actually caring about something beyond yourself. Ezra Scrooge, standing in Margaret's kitchen on Christmas morning with tears on his face, wasn't having a dramatic transformation. He was having a moment of surrender, admitting that he couldn't do it alone anymore. That safety wasn't worth the cost, that he'd rather risk pain than guarantee emptiness. And that moment, that choice, it didn't fix everything. It just started everything. Started years of difficult daily work. Started a relationship that was complicated and required effort and wasn't always easy. Started a family that frustrated him and exhausted him and gave him more meaning than he'd thought possible. Started a life that was actually worth living. You can have that too. Not the same life. You're not Ezra. You're not living in 1780. Your circumstances are different. But the same choice. The same possibility. The same option to stop protecting yourself quite so thoroughly and start actually living. It won't look like a Christmas movie. It won't be neat or clean or resolved in 90 minutes. It'll be messy and hard, and sometimes you'll regret it and wonder why you didn't just stay safely numb. But you'll also have moments, maybe rare, maybe brief, but real, where you feel actually connected to another human, actually seen, actually alive. And those moments will make everything else worth it. The modern world doesn't make this easy. Everything about our society is designed to keep you isolated, consuming, too busy, and distracted for real connection. The algorithms want you scrolling, not talking. The economy wants you working, not resting. The culture wants you performing, not being. Choosing differently is an act of rebellion. Choosing vulnerability in a world that values invulnerability. Choosing presence in a world that rewards distraction. Choosing connection in a world built on isolation. That's what makes you a Grinch in the best sense. Someone who sees through the bullshit, recognizes the performance, refuses to participate in the hollow version of connection society is selling. But it's also what makes you human. Someone who, despite seeing all the problems, chooses to try anyway. Who creates meaning even when meaning isn't provided. Who builds connection even when connection requires work. Ezra did it in 1780. Dickens wrote about it in 1843. Seuss illustrated it in 1957. And you can do it now, today, in whatever year you're reading this. The mechanism changes. The technology evolves. The specific challenges are different. But the core remains the same. You can choose. You can change. It's hard and scary and worth it anyway. So, if you're sitting there reading this, feeling isolated or bitter or convinced that connection is impossible in the modern world, you're the Grinch. You're Ezra on that bridge. You're standing in the snow wondering if it's too late, if you're too damaged, if change is even possible. It is. It's possible. It's hard, but it's possible. You don't need a supernatural intervention. You don't need 3 ghosts or a figure without a face or a magical snowstorm. You just need one moment of courage. One choice to reach out instead of retreat. One decision to try. Call someone. Show up somewhere. Say something true. Do something kind even when you don't feel like it. Especially when you don't feel like it. Because feelings follow actions more often than actions follow feelings. Start small. Start anywhere. Just start. Because the alternative, the safe, controlled, carefully isolated existence, it's not actually safer. It's just slower dying. And you deserve better than that. Everyone deserves better than that. The first Grinch learned this in 1780. It's 2025 now. The lesson hasn't changed. The need hasn't changed. Only the context has changed. So be the Grinch. See through the performance. Recognize the hollowness. Call out the hypocrisy. And then be human anyway. Connect anyway. Love anyway. Try anyway. That's the story. That's always been the story. That will always be the story. Now it's yours to live. So how does this story end? It doesn't, really. Because Ezra Scrooge's story isn't about an ending. It's about a beginning that keeps beginning. Every day, every choice, every moment he decided, once again, to be human instead of a ghost. He died in 1803, but the story didn't die with him. It evolved, changed form, became Dickens's Scrooge, then Seuss's Grinch, then 1,000 variations across cultures and centuries. The details changed, but the core remained. The person who forgot how to feel and had to relearn. The person who chose safety over connection and discovered that safety was its own kind of death. History forgot Ezra Scrooge the individual, but it remembered Ezra Scrooge the archetype, the possibility he represented, the choice he made. And that's actually more important than any individual life. Because stories do what individual humans cannot. They persist. They adapt. They reach people across time and space and circumstance. They plant seeds that might not bloom for generations, but bloom eventually. Somewhere right now, someone is having their London Bridge moment. Standing in metaphorical snow, confronted by metaphorical ghosts, being forced to see what they've become and what they're choosing. Maybe it's triggered by loss or loneliness or just exhaustion with their own numbness. Maybe it's dramatic or maybe it's quiet. Maybe it looks like a breakdown or maybe it looks like a simple decision to call an old friend. The mechanism doesn't matter. What matters is the choice that follows. Whether they retreat back to safety or step forward into uncertainty. Whether they choose control or connection. Whether they stay a ghost or become human again. Some of them will choose wrong, will retreat, will convince themselves that safety is enough. Will live their entire lives behind walls they built to protect themselves, never realizing the walls became their prison. And some of them will choose differently, will take one terrified step toward vulnerability, will reach out even though reaching out risks rejection. Will try even though trying risks failure. Those are Ezra's children, his legacy. Not blood descendants, those are long gone, names forgotten, DNA diluted beyond recognition, but spiritual descendants. People who heard some version of his story and thought, maybe I could try too. Margaret remarried after Ezra died, had more children, lived another 20 years. Died having touched hundreds of lives in small ways that history never recorded. Their children married, had children of their own, spread across England and eventually the world. Statistically, if you have any English ancestry, you probably have some genetic connection to Ezra Scrooge. Tiny, fractional, meaningless in any practical sense, but the story connection? That's stronger than genetics. That persists in ways DNA cannot. Every time someone reads A Christmas Carol or watches a Grinch movie or hears some variation of The Person Who Hated Christmas and Learned to Love Again, they're connecting to Ezra, to his choice, to his struggle, to his hard-won transformation. And maybe they change too. Maybe they don't. Maybe they file the story away as entertainment and never think about it again. Or maybe some small part of them remembers when they need it most. When they're standing on their own bridge, in their own storm, making their own choice about whether to stay frozen or start moving. That's how stories save people. Not dramatically, not obviously, just by being there when they're needed. By showing what's possible. By planting seeds that might bloom years later in circumstances the original storyteller could never have imagined. Ezra would have hated this, probably. The idea of becoming a story, an archetype, a lesson. He was just trying to survive, just trying to stop hurting, just trying to figure out how to be human after 20 years of practicing numbness. He wasn't trying to inspire anyone or teach anything or become part of cultural mythology. But that's how legacy works. You don't get to control it. You just live your life as best you can. Make your choices. Do your small acts of kindness or courage or vulnerability. And then those choices ripple outward in ways you'll never see, touching people you'll never meet, changing things you'll never know about. The girl with the gingerbread became a mother who taught her children that small kindnesses matter. One of those children became a teacher who remembered that lesson and extended grace to struggling students. One of those students grew up to start a charity that fed thousands. None of them knew about Ezra. But he's there, in the chain of causation, in the ripple of choices spreading outward through time. That's not metaphysical. That's just how humans work. We're connected. Our choices affect each other in ways both obvious and invisible. Nothing happens in isolation. No act is truly individual. We're all part of an impossibly complex web of influence and connection. Whether we acknowledge it or not, Ezra chose connection, chose vulnerability, chose to engage with that web instead of trying to escape it. And that choice echoes, will always echo. So how does this story end? It doesn't. It just keeps beginning. Every time someone makes that choice, every time someone steps out of safety into uncertainty, every time someone risks pain for the possibility of joy. You reading this right now, you're part of the story too. Whether you know it or not, whether you choose to be or not, because stories aren't separate from life. They're how we make sense of life, how we find patterns in chaos, how we remember what matters when everything else fades. The first Grinch was born in a snowstorm in 1780. But the Grinch never dies because the choice never dies. It's always there, always available, always waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough or exhausted enough with numbness to finally take it. Be that person. Be brave. Be desperate. Be exhausted with numbness. Be whatever you need to be to make the choice. Choose connection. Choose vulnerability. Choose to be human even when being human is hard. That's the story. That's always been the story. That will always be the story. Now go live it. The bells are ringing. Christmas morning. Every morning. The world is waiting. Frozen and beautiful and terrible and full of people who are just as scared and lonely and desperate for connection as you are. Go find them. Go be found by them. Go create something real in a world of performance. Go build something true in a culture of lies. Go be the Grinch who learned to love Christmas, not because Christmas is perfect, but because loving imperfect things is what makes us human. Go be Ezra, standing on the bridge, making the choice, taking the step. Go be alive.